Hello, this is your host Todd Luce of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, I am joined by Frederick Voltaire-Bastiat, Ghost of Buckley, and Master Sanders to discuss problems with reactionary thinking. Now, a brief history. The last 10 years or so, maybe the last 15 years or so, neo-reactionary thinking has become quite, in certain circles, quite common on the internet. Sort of goes back to a guy named Firdas Yavin, who has used the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug, and he would try to argue for reactionary thinking in a new way. Traditionally, reactionary thinking is associated with throne and altar states that are generally feudal and generally heavily centralized around a monarch. He tries to create a more modern, almost secular view based around corporatism, where you have a corporation that runs everything, and sort of it's a 21st century, facelift for that kind of thinking. But he's basically trying to preserve the same kind of social order. And a lot of times what you'll see is reactionaries, neo-reactionaries point out the fact that, normie conservatives, libertarians, and other groups have failed at stopping communism. And that may be true in some sense, because we're dealing with the cultural Marxists right now. But the reactionaries have no success. The Russian Revolution, French Revolution, all these other revolutions where reactionaries always lose. I mean, I can't really think of a historic example where you had this, life and death struggle between a reactionary institution and a communist institution, and the reactionary in the long term winning. Maybe the only exception might be the short-term victory over Napoleon. But in the long run, they still lost. I mean, communism won, essentially. So I think to start off, I think one of the aspects of why reactionaries always lose is when it gets down to a shooting war with communism, they do lose. We see this in the French Revolution. We see this in Cuba. We see this in Russia. We see this in the Spanish colonies in the 1820s. And I think one of the key reasons why they fail in these areas is what I call the 4 M's: motivation, mobilization, meritocracy, and method. Motivation, due to the sort of feudal autocratic nature of reactionary states, reactionary social orders, the people are not really invested in the system, right? They're treated little better than chattel, second-class citizens, and they don't own the land they work on. And so when they are called to fight against the communists are like, yeah, land, we'll give you land and all this stuff. Of course, communists are lying, but these people aren't educated. So again, in a reactionary society, they have this kind of elitist tendency where they want to have this elite, whether it's a religious elite or an intellectual elite. They should be in charge. And so what you would then have is these people that don't want to fight for the system, whereas the communists, promising the moon, and they're all highly motivated, so they're better able to motivate their people. They're also better able to mobilize the resources they have. In the 18th century, warfare was typically small scale because the soldiers were criminals or people that were, kidnapped, like with the Royal Navy, and so you couldn't really give them a lot of leeway to make independent activity because they might just run away. Whereas with a more populist army that the communists can raise, you can have troops you can trust them to take independent action and not run away. The 3rd M is meritocracy. Reactionary societies tend to appoint people to be leaders based on their class, right? You're the nobility, you're the brother of the king or whatever, not because you're actually a good general. Whereas you go like Trotsky or Napoleon, they would hire men that were talented, that could get the job done, and they didn't care about the class background. So that gives them an edge on that. And then method, which is strategy and tactics, they're better able to plan a strategy because, again, the reactionary state has a sort of class interest, and they have people that are in these positions not based on talent but based on class. And they have an overall strategy for winning a war. I mean, you look at, say, classically Russia in the revolution. Lenin, you have unity of command under politically Lenin, militarily Trotsky. The whites never had that. You had at best three competing white armies: the Denikin and the Donbass, Kolchak in Siberia, and Yudenich in the Baltic states. And so they were disorganized, infighting, and they just couldn't get it together. And I think those four M's sort of demonstrate why the communists usually win militarily. But when I say reactionary, what we're basically mean is a society that is centralized in centralized power in the hands of a few, usually the nobility or clerics, feudal in their economic arrangements, and they're anti-egalitarian, so they're not in favor of sort of the communist egalitarian structures. So I guess I'll begin with Master Sanders. What are some of your thoughts on the problems with reactionary thinking and what's been discussed so far?
Yes, and I think that's perhaps the strongest case against reactionism might be its track record against communism. But first of all, I do want to touch on a few things, at least when it comes to why reactionism does have some good points. Now, one of the things that is useful about reactionary thought is that it provides an excellent critique of modernity that's not postmodern. Like for anyone who's talked to postmoderns extensively, you get this impression that before modernity, everybody was postmodern. So, but reactionaries tend to be in touch with the level of thinking that was definitely present, or at least that they claim to be present, prior to the advent of modernity, which you can advocate for both a sense of spirituality and of community, while at the same time understanding truth as being objective. So that's one good thing that reactionary thought tends to do well. Another is related perhaps to their critique of modernity is their understanding that people are definitely part of communities in a way that postmoderns do, but postmoderns usually approach it from a much more of a humanist / a secular perspective, and so most reactionaries understand the importance of spirituality in a real sense as opposed to just a communally understood sense to individuals and to humanity. So there are some useful aspects to reactionary thought, at least if coming from a conservative perspective. The problem is that when it comes to actual change, actual political track record, reactionaries have a pretty poor record, as you pointed out. Not just when it comes to the Western world. We can point out some very obvious examples. I would also include as a potential, albeit problematic, example of how reactionism could possibly have some success, or be attributed to have some success, might be the Spanish Civil War. So you had Franco successfully routed the communists and liberals back in the 1930s, but the problem was after a few decades of his rule, and he handed it over to a king, which Spain should have ostensibly become a throne and altar society, as many people who had supported Franco had hoped. What did Juan Carlos do? Juan Carlos made a deal with liberals and Democrats, and when the reactionaries attempted to save what they could in the 1980s, Juan Carlos sided with the liberals. And so today, Spain is well on its way to becoming much more of a liberal Western European state, much like France. So, or reactionary thought has not, at least in the West, and I would even argue in the East, has not had a very good track record of stopping communism. One minor note on China, for example. In China, in the 1890s, you had the Guangxu Emperor, who attempted to create some sort of liberal reforms within imperial China, much to the level that the Japanese had. The problem is that people within his family, most notably the Dowager Empress, who was responsible for a palace coup, had him imprisoned, and it resulted in China going back to a much more reactionary stance, which made China not only open to more radical, Jacobin thought in the form of the nationalists, but that later succumbed to the chaos that led to, communist China several decades later. So if we look at reactionary thought as a bulwark against communism, in a practical sense, I would agree with you, Todd, is that they haven't had a really good track record.
Yeah. So what are some of your thoughts on this, Ghost of Buckley?
Well, I think I would like to take a focus on the reactionary political philosophy, because I think that is where a lot of reactionaries trip up. You see, when it comes to critiquing modern political philosophy and modern philosophy in general, reactionaries are on the top of their game. They have, I think, some of their critiques are devastating. For instance, their critiques of postmodern metaphysics, their critiques of egalitarianism and liberalism, I think, have draw blood in ways that other philosophies cannot. Other right wing philosophies just can't measure up to. However, when it comes to actually creating a political system from reactionary thought, the results are subpar at best. I mean, you take a look at the French Revolution. It has been argued by many historians. I think Alexis de Tocqueville started this critique, but that the centralization found in the Bourbon monarchy led to the Jacobins centralizing power in Paris. I mean, if you look at the vast majority of French people, they were all basically peasants, poor peasants that lived in the countryside. And outside of them not liking feudalism, they were very conservative. They supported Catholicism, they supported the monarchy, but because power was centralized in just one location, which was at first Versailles, and then on the eve of the French Revolution, it was switched to Paris. The radicals in Paris take over, and we have Jacobins going around murdering nuns and getting rid of the Gregorian calendar. So, what I would like to say, they rely on a model of Oriental despotism that is prone to falling prey to Jacobin and communistic thought, communistic philosophy, and political activism, because of just the sheer amount of centralization involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would have to say.
Okay. What are some of your thoughts on this, Frederick Bastia?
I think reactionaries are definitely obsessed with a past that was never was. Like you said, that reactionary thought tend to fetishize feudalism and monarchy, absolute monarchy. But when you look at the material conditions of them, it was a very poor way of living. It was a very poor way. Also, it was a very extractive system. Like they try to glorify a system, but when you look at the economic and material reality of it, it was like it's not a great way to live. It's not a good way to improve material conditions. They're definitely obsessed with a dead past that they know they cannot revive by any means. I often agree with their critiques of classical liberalism, and to a lesser extent libertarianism, but it seemed like the implication of this return to the past somehow seemed to be rather utopian thinking on their parts. Um, that's all I have to say on this.
Okay. Yeah, I think what we kind of have, the areas we've discussed, problem number one is misplaced trust in authority, especially centralized autocratic authority. One thing we didn't bring up, and I'd like to bring this to the table, is, well, I did briefly touch on this, is meritocracy. Not just in the realm of warfare, where the reactionaries typically lose their revolutions against the communists, but also in just managing the affairs of state. I mean, I've heard, numerous YouTubers who self-identify as reactionaries is saying that you can't actually have a meritocracy. And I'm like, just keep on telling yourself that, and you'll keep on losing to the communists, because even though from the vantage point of the United States and Britain, the communists aren't very meritocratic, they are more meritocratic generally than reactionary states, and that gives them a competitive advantage. And then also, the other thing about that we seem to agree on is that the reactionaries, while they're correct on their anti-modern sentiments, are also, hold to, outdated economic ideas like feudalism or some form of central planning and an extractive method that doesn't really lead to a flourishing society that's robust in resisting communism. I mean, spoiler alert, the Soviet Union wasn't defeated by a reactionary, it was defeated by Ronald Reagan. Okay, so spoiler alert, reactionaries didn't beat communism, at least as a military threat. And this is something that reactionaries all too quickly forget, is that in 1980, the Soviet Union was the most powerful autocratic empire that had ever existed. It was a threat to world peace and could have destroyed the world with its nuclear, biological, chemical arsenals, and was one of the most ruthless, despotic regimes in history. And yet, in a period of 10 years, say from 1981 to 1991, it peacefully dissolved and dissipated. I mean, this is incredible. This is the greatest threat to world peace in history, and it's defeated by Ronald Reagan and later George Herbert Walker Bush. And so, we can all point out numerous flaws, undoubtedly, with Bush and Reagan. But they did what no reactionary, or for that matter, fascist, could ever do: actually defeat communism in the Soviet Union. And even though we're dealing with cultural Marxists now, the world is, I think, a lot better off. Our position is much stronger because of the defeat of the Soviet Union, something that reactionaries could only ever dream of doing. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
I'd like to kind of get back to what you were talking about with their understanding of meritocracy. Now, whether or not you're a classical liberal or whether you're an ideological Democrat or wherever you fall on the spectrum, there's a lot to criticize about democracy as a system, or even as just a philosophy in and of itself. Democracy. Let's be honest here. Democracy is a terrible system. I like to say that it was democracy that killed Jesus, right? So again, there's plenty to defeat about democracy, to critique about democracy. The problem is that why reactionaries hamper themselves, and how I've seen reactionaries hamper themselves, is that it's not just that democracy is flawed. It's just that democracy is so flawed, it's not even worth engaging in. It's not worth dealing with. And so reactionaries are doomed to the periphery because of their ideological allegiances to centralized monarchy, paternalistic autocracy, etc. It's going to doom them as a political movement. It's very easy for people on the internet to kind of just go through their Tumblr blogs like I've seen with their reposting Nazi and monarchical aesthetics and pat themselves on the back for revolting against the modern world, a term I detest. But what are they actually doing? So this is one of those things where ideology is important now, how their own ideology, how their own thinking has hampered them. So if reactionaries will never get a chance really to defeat communism in a way, because they're really not doing anything to win people over to their side, which is a shame, really, if you ask me.
Yeah. So what are some of your thoughts, Buckley?
I'm just looking at the chat here, and pragmatic culture is saying things like, "Oh, we need to." The reason reactionaries lose is because we didn't execute enough liberals.
I've heard that before, yes, from some Eastern Orthodox reactionaries as well.
And what I would say to that is, well, if you can't create a effective political coalition, you're not going to get anywhere in politics. That's just a given. I mean, political alliances between people with different visions is part of the matter, of course, in politics all throughout all throughout the years. And in the modern day, if you want a lot of the anti-left-wing forces are either liberal and reactionary. And if reactionaries are going to go like, well, what we need to do is just murder all the liberals, how does that make them any different from the crazed anarchists that also don't get anything done because they're just so much into purity spiral?
Well, this gives a good point, Buckley, is that I'll give you three historical examples that show that when a new idea comes on the scene, trying to kill everybody that believes it never works. Christianity comes on the scene, the Romans try to kill us off, doesn't work. In fact, it makes us stronger. Reformation, the Catholic Church tries to kill the reformers. If anything, that accelerates the Reformation. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, reactionary states were killing and imprisoning the radicals. And again, if anything, that nearly accelerated the process. We don't have any even the Soviet Union tried to do it by killing all the liberal reformers. Didn't work. We don't have a single historical example of a new idea being stopped like this, where within a country there's a revolutionary force coming and you just kill everybody off and we're done. We're good. No, it doesn't work. It just feeds that new idea. You have to have good ideas are beaten with better ideas, bad ideas are beaten with better ideas. What are some of your thoughts on this, Frederick Bastiat?
You brought that up and sort of just reminded me how Bismarck handled the socialists, where he basically installed safety nets and other revolutionary social programs to prevent a socialist revolution when Germany was unified. So you're right that violent suppression of ideas won't work, with the exception of Pinochet's Chile. It's just rather interesting. Also, it seemed like reactionary thoughts is good at critiquing, but not good at solution. It's not really good at solution. It's just like they just need to know how to prepare for modernity. They need to know how to prepare for modernity. Like, that's just always inevitable when it comes to civilization, empires, and other things, that they need to know how to prepare for it than just obsessing with that past.
Well, exactly. And because with the communist challenge that we're all concerned about, the first wave was open, violent military revolution. And what's interesting is we got two interesting cases here. In 1918, Germany and Russia. They both were losers in the Great War. They both had communist revolutions on their hands. But the Germans, under Egbert, under the beginning of the Weimar Republic, I think he was a social democrat, defeats the communists. Whereas the autocratic whites just completely spin their wheels in the mud and get destroyed. So we have a very interesting comparison here, that the social democrats in Germany, mobilizing the disgruntled German war veterans, were able to defeat the communist insurgency and revolution, but not in Russia. And so right there, I'm not a fan of social democracy, but social democracy has a better track record of defeating communism than does reactionary thinking. What are some of your thoughts on these topics, Buckley?
Well, just because a movement can defeat communism militarily doesn't mean the ideology behind that movement is correct. There's and this is the main critique of reactionaries is their methods, though, because their methods do come from their ideology. They're not going to, like you said, they reject meritocracy in favor of creating a sort of aristocracy that is based on nobility of birth. you know, and that doesn't defeat that doesn't create good generals. Sorry about that. Sorry, I just got a call. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, that's generally what I would say about about that. And I would also like to point out a common trope amongst reactionaries: the not that wasn't true reactionary trope. You can see this in the comments section of in the chat section of this video, with Pragmatic Culture saying, quote, "The Romanovs were too Western to ever stabilize Russia. A true Russian autocracy would have been far different." Sorry, I keep getting phone calls. Can I? But by all means, could you maybe you could talk a bit about that while I'm
Sure. Well, yeah. I mean, you know, brutal repression, as we pointed out, doesn't work. I mean, Russia did do that in the 19th century with Alexander III, and that just made it worse. And China was an autocracy that brutally repressed people, and yeah, that didn't stop it either. And of course, by the same token, Soviet repression did not stop the rising tide of Western liberalism. So, well, what we do have that's interesting here is that communism as an idea that Karl Marx advocates was defeated at the end of the Cold War. Very few people today actually advocate for a stateless, classless society in the sense that Marx envisioned it, as a sort of, you know, going through the socialist state, you know, the revolution to the socialist state to communism, where the socialist state controls the means of production. In fact, the modern left has largely abandoned class interests for race and gender issues. So in essence, we do have a victory over a strain of Marxist leftist thinking. It's metastasized, and it's gone towards race and gender. And we'll see as to whether they'll win there or not. It's still up in the air. So what are some of your thoughts on that, Master Sanders?
Yes, I don't have too much to add to that other than to say, yeah, simply trying to kill off all your opponents is not going to help. I mean, one thing that, just a general statement on radical movements in general, is that whenever there's a failure, whether it's communism or fascism or reactionary thought or what have you, there's usually a tendency to blame it on lack of loyalty to the system, or that they're not true X. And of course, if you're a little more adventurous, you might could blame the Jews in that instance. Like, for some reason, I don't know, the Jews ruined China for some reason. I don't know. The point being is, that it doesn't surprise me that you do have some reactionaries that might try to defend, try to, or at least defend their position by saying, you know, X wasn't a true reactionary, or X was too lenient.
Yeah. What are some of your thoughts, Frederick Bastiat?
Let's see. I think reactionaries can fall into a libertarian, utopian rationalist trap by dreaming what their ideal society, but I think in reality they can't perform it. They can't get there because it's just a impossibility now that they need to develop a lot of these institutions that they want to get there, but that's just an impossibility. They just need to wait till the system that they hate and that they constantly criticize to collapse. Then they can rebuild their social order or anything.
Yeah. I think one other thing that the reactionaries tend to be also extremely pessimistic, I think, beyond what reason would warrant. So, for example, if you had been a conservative or reactionary in 1960 or 1970 or 1980 during the height of the Cold War, and you saw that, you know, about a third of the world's population or more was communist, they had large nuclear arsenals, large, powerful militaries that threatened the peace and security of all of us. I mean, that was really terrible. And now communism of that variety, state communism, state ownership of the means of production, is a laughing stock almost everywhere. I mean, it's about as discredited as any political system can be. And so fighting this new metastasized version of communism, we're, I think, in a much better position. They don't have any sort of, massive external outside nation funding them. Because we have to remember as well, in the 1960s, most of these radical movements, they had a lot of funding from the Soviet Union and outside communist forces, which isn't present anymore. And so, that puts us in a better perspective. And what ends up happening is reactionaries end up imitating the communists they hate so much, right? The communists will look at the modern world and say, wow, the modern world really sucks, capitalism sucks. And they have this like utopian fairy tale of communism in the back of their mind. And then, well, yeah, I mean, any reality is going to suck compared to a utopian fantasy. And that's exactly what the reactionaries do. They say, look, these normie conservatives and libertarians, they just suck. I mean, look at all the victories these communists are making. And then they compare it to some, non-existent fictional world in their mind. Because in real life, they're in the ash bin of history. They did nothing to stop communism. In fact, this is an observation that I've made. You've never had a successful communist revolution in a Protestant country. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think, and there does seem that there's a strong anti-Protestant trend in neo-reactionary thinking, which, of course, given that we're the only people that have avoided a communist revolution in Europe and in the New World, that seems very strange. Why would you attack the one thing that actually works at stopping communism? I think you might have something to say about this, Master Sanders.
Yes, perhaps I would tend to agree with you there. Is that we see that radicalism does develop in Protestant countries as much as it does in non-Protestant countries. But the difference being is that we don't necessarily see the same successes, right? You had Marx theorizing that industrial states, which happen to be very Protestant, places such as Germany or Great Britain, would be the first states to have such revolution. In reality, as we know, the opposite was the case. We see in many countries where revolution happened were not in highly industrialized states, or not in very Protestant states, but were in states that were, in fact, quite reactionary or in some ways economically backward, such as obviously for Soviet Union, rising out of highly Eastern Orthodox country. We see similar radical movements in South America being in predominantly Catholic countries. And we see, of course, in China being not necessarily a Christian nation by any stretch of the imagination, but a nation that was very much from a very ancient reactionary culture, communism having a strong level of support among the peasantry. So it's obvious that is one thing to consider, is that the more reactionary a culture is, the more likely it is to be open and susceptible, as you pointed out, to more radical movements.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on that, Frederick Bastiat?
I have no comment on this.
Yeah. Now, it is true that, Protestantism isn't the only resource one could appeal to. I mean, Japan, which is a Shinto country, avoided it as well by industrializing and developing a middle class. And so it's not necessarily required, but I think the middle class is actually important. Of all of the socioeconomic factors, the single most important in my mind in preventing the successful rise of a communist despotism is a robust middle class. We saw this in Northwestern Europe, which was predominantly Protestant. We saw it in Japan, which was primarily Shinto. And then in the post-war era, Taiwan and South Korea, they also developed a large middle class, and were relatively successful at blunting communist aggression. And in post-war Europe, Italy and France developed large, robust middle classes. And while they were teetering on the brink of communism in the 30s and 40s, largely grew beyond that. So I think, what do you think about that, Buckley? The idea that robust middle class is probably the single most important socioeconomic factor in preventing the rise of communism?
Oh yes, I would say out of all of them, and again, the robust middle class arises in a certain type of economy that reactionaries hate, the economy of a more free market. Now, this isn't exactly a Protestant. This isn't exactly a Protestant Catholic thing so much as this is a reactionary, liberal thing. Liberal ideology tends to favor free market systems, and reactionary ideology tends to favor more feudalistic or corporatist systems. And the problem is, if you free market systems are the ones that lead to a middle class that it stands as a bulwark to violent revolution. Now, you can also now, quoting Thomas Sowell, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. We can discuss the problems a middle class brings, which are unique to communist revolutions, unique in comparison to communist revolutions. You know, all about how there's this middle class bourgeois morality that says, oh, we can't be racist, we can't be sexist, we can't be homophobic, but and the reactionaries have every right to criticize that. However, the reactionaries cannot say that there isn't some sort of a connection between the middle class and the lack of violent revolutions, because the middle class, outside of like LARPing communist students, the middle class is fairly peaceful.
Yeah.
You know, and we can go over, and we can go over a bit why that is. Maybe I think that's a good. We should really go over why exactly the middle class doesn't get involved in these violent revolutions as much.
Well, yeah. Before we get there, Master Sanders, you had something you wanted to add?
Oh yes, actually, two things real quick. First of all, we were talking about with Protestantism. I think it's called. I could be could be remembering it incorrectly, but I think it's either the Halavi thesis or the Levy thesis or something like that. It is the theory that the English middle class, which was in many ways would have been ripe for revolution. Not the middle class, I'm sorry, the working class, which would have been ripe for revolution, given their working conditions, given the fact that many of them were not property owners per se. One thing that perhaps prevented revolution in those areas was the advent of Methodism. That Methodism was a strain of Anglican thought, or of the Anglican Church, that actually reached out to those areas that were not traditionally catered to by an otherwise very much a high church tradition. So we do see, in a sense, even if England's a sort of weird exception, because Anglicanism is in this limbo between the high church traditions of Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox thought, as well as being influenced by Protestant thought. It was the advent of dissenting groups such as Methodism and to a lesser extent Baptists and others that were actually able to reach out to the lower classes and probably in many ways inoculate Britain from the aspect of from the potential revolution. But the second thing is going back more to this idea of property ownership. I think one trend that you tend to see in revolutionary states is, or always states that tend to become revolutionary, is ownership of property. Now, reactionaries are sort of all over the board on this, but I would say that perhaps the best thing, as you've pointed out, Todd, is in order for there to be a truly prosperous, peaceful, and for the most part a stable society, you have to have a robust middle class, or I would put it better as a very sizable property class. So that can include someone who owns his own store, someone who owns his own farm. not necessarily bourgeois in the sense of merchant class, but people who own the productive property. Some call this distributism or democratic capitalism or what have you. But there's always a sense that people own a stake in the society. People own something within society that makes them want to value it and wants to preserve it. The problem with some aspects of reactionary thought, again, they're not unified necessarily on this point, but the problem with some aspects of reactionary thought, of going back to this more of a structured, aristocratic, class-based system that's more or less neo-feudalist, is that it does the same thing that communism does, and that what many critiques of capitalism does is that it dissociates people from their productive property. And so again, if we're going to try to come up with a way that can effectively defeat communism and preserve a stable society, we need to have, as you point out, Todd, a very strong property class.
Yeah. Now, to answer Buckley's question, why is the middle class typically less violent and less prone to revolutionary outbursts? This is actually described by Aristotle in Book 4 of the Politics. He points out that in a city-state, you got three classes: the rich, the poor, and the middle class. The poor typically are uneducated and have a relatively difficult life, and so they tend to be, due to the excess leisure they have, due to their poverty, they tend to organize rebellions against the status quo. The rich typically try to manage the state in a way to centralize as much wealth into their hands. And they have a lot of leisure time as well because of their wealth, and they then hatch conspiracies and plots against the state. The middle class is different. They're essentially treading water. They have enough wealth that they're not envious like the poor, but they don't have enough. But they have to maintain the household. They have to work and maintain things. So their mind is focused on productive work. And they also avoid the arrogance of the rich, because it's not that they're like making ends meet, though I suppose some middle class might be that bad off. But without all this wealth to just, hide behind, have your bad decisions covered up by, you have a much more realistic view of life. So they avoid the arrogance of the rich, the envy of the poor, and the bourgeois values of the middle class tend to be those of thrift, hard work, and responsibility. And it's funny, right? Reactionaries are always touting Aristotle and, oh, Aristotle this, Thomism that. But then, they say that the middle class is, some cucky liberalism, when it was Aristotle that told us all this. So I know you have something to say on this, Buckley.
I'm actually just talking to pragmatic culture who is right now accusing me of being a free market shill for saying that free markets are correct. And this is sort of the problem with reactionaries. Reactionaries in general, they tend to view free market economics, which, let's be honest here, it is generally successful in uplifting poverty, even if some of the more neoliberal strains of thought are go against traditional values and traditional institutions. And the main problem I have with the reactionary critique of free market capitalism is that it generally boils down to, well, if we make people too rich, then it will hurt their spiritual lives. Well, the main problem with that is that, well, if you make people too poor, then you're going to get communism.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really what I would say. Now, there are strains of reactionary thought that try to create a more free market based system that or at least a traditional system that can work within free markets. Like some distributists are like that. Some people that want to endorse Hans Hermann Hoppe and his proprietarianism are like that. But outside of them, they are they will call anybody who disagrees with them on free markets materialists, because apparently if you don't want people to be dirt poor, then all you care about is making money.
Yeah, yeah. What are some of your thoughts on this? Oh, sorry, were you done, Buckley?
Yes. But I would like to ask you, Todd, what do you think about that? Reactionaries tend to characterize people who support free markets as being morally degenerate or materialist in some way.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's sort of the classic critique, right and left, of capitalist theory and practice. Again, there's probably some truth to the fact that capitalism does encourage these vices. But again, as you said with Thomas Sowell, there's no solutions, just trade-offs. Yeah, but what's the trade-off? You avoid a communist despotism. I mean, I think it's a pretty good trade-off. But yeah, there aren't very many reactionaries that are economically literate. They're almost like the communists on the right. You know, the economically illiterate types. But I was going to ask Frederick Bostad, do you have anything that you'd like to add to this?
To play devil advocates, when you say like reactionary stories want this semi-feudal thing, like I think they value a aristocratic class. Like for the more nuanced strains of reactionary thought as proprietarianism, they value the Anglo-Saxons model of aristocracy, of aristocratic rule, because there was a division of power between the noblemen and the king, as a king as the last resort. It's just like it's sort of just like that. Some reactionary wants that aristocratic rule, and some reactionaries don't really like the middle class having any type of power in government, because they're always gonna create bad decisions, bad incentives. Like they're basically gonna incentivize short-term thinking and bad policies, like dispersing costs and concentrating benefits. When you have a middle class democracies, what reactionary wants to return to that aristocratic rule. Even in traditional conservative thoughts, such as Eric von, I cannot say Ladin noted in Leftism, revisited. He said that Edmund Burke traveled around France, and people under this aristocratic rule were generally happy. So that's me done playing devil's advocate.
Well, as far as the middle class argument, I think Aristotle just speaks for himself. Thus, it is the greatest good fortune for those who are engaged in politics to have a middling and sufficient property, because where some possess very many things and others nothing, either rule of the people in this extreme form must come into being, or an unmixed oligarchy, or as a result of both of these excesses, tyranny. For tyrannies arise from the most headstrong sort of democracy and from oligarchy, but much less often from the middling sorts of regimes and those close to them. 12.9.5b39 of the Politics. There just isn't any evidence for this that there's the original quote, democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else. I think that's wrong, but the middle class is the worst form of social organization except for everything else, because it leads to the best results insofar as stopping and blunting communism. Now, as far as aristocracy, though, in Anglo-Saxon cultures, well, the United States really never had an aristocracy. And in England, the aristocracy pretty much just receded into irrelevancy after the English Civil War. So, I mean, that would be an odd reactionary that wants that kind of a system. I just don't really see that as going anywhere. What
Well,
are
he
some of
was
your
on your channel before.
Who was?
This reactionary was on your channel before.
Oh, okay. Do you have anything you want to add, Master Sanders?
Not particularly. I think you got it down.
Well, is there anything that we want to add? I think we've kind of covered most of our criticisms of reactionary thinking. Is there anything that you want to end with, Ghost Buckley? Anything we missed?
Oh, well, yes. What we would hope from reactionary movements, I think a little bit more humility towards normal conservatives if they really want to make a difference in the mainstream. I think what they should do is bring some of their critiques to more mainstream conservatives and try to make a way to work around some of the problems in their proposed solutions, because I think reactionaries are strongest when they are critiquing modern ideas, not when they are coming up with new ideas themselves. Yeah, that's what I would have to say.
All right. Is there anything you want to leave us with, Frederick Bastiat?
I say get more realistic. What type of social order you want for type of society. There's no chance to return to a feudal king and lords. Also, that's pretty much what I have to say about reactionary thought.
Okay. Master Sanders, anything you want to leave us with?
Again, when it comes to affecting any real social change, the fatal flaw of reactionary thought is that because of its assumptions, because of its hatred of democracy and meritocracy and similar systems that have allowed for change within the West, or allowed for other even more fringe ideologies to gain traction within the West, within recent years, reactionary thought is going to be doomed to the periphery. So, at best, I think, again, the best we could say about reactionary thought is it offers a great criticism. But what good would it be if we can't really implement these ideas?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we can. I think I'll just say reactionary, not yet communist. You mean? This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.